Très bien. Donc, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue pour la 6e conférence qui est organisée par Susannah Hays et qui va nous parler de l'implication de la fonction du nerf vagus dans l'évolution humaine et les niveaux normatifs supérieurs de l'éducation. Good evening and welcome to everyone. We are pleased to welcome Susannah Hays to the 6th CIRET conference. Susannah, I give you the floor and I let you present the title of your conference.
D'accord. Bonsoir à tous. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am in Santa Fe, New Mexico, speaking to you. And I would first like to thank CIRET, Jean and Florent for their invitation. And also I wish to acknowledge Basarab Niculescu, whose philosophy of nature and care for humanity speaks to my heart. Maria de Mello and Victoria de Barros, with whom I've recently had the pleasure of working with, especially for our program for the World Congress with C-Trans. And last, my deepest appreciation something's not moving on my slides. Okay. My deepest appreciation goes to Carol Terry Lindahl of the Entropy Institute and Dr. Stephen Porges. It's on the basis of our years of work together that brings me to speak to the transdisciplinarity community at large. And I also need to thank Anna for her translation. This evening, our discussion will focus on the function of the autonomic nervous system. Though we take our biology for granted until something goes wrong, our well-being in relation to higher normative levels of learning requires the capacity for our biology, our vagus nerve in particular, to function beyond health concerns. Our capacity to receive signals from the vagus is in fact the biological function that assists our being able to recognize the hidden third principle. That is the intrinsic force to trans or embody transdisciplinarity's theoretical goals. My paper, Nature as Discourse, derives from a philosophy of nature and presents the argument that transdisciplinarity's triad model will only succeed in obtaining its 3 levels of reality when it incorporates the autonomic cognitive forces within Homo sapiens' phylogenetic organization. Since co-evolutionary principles of human brain and autonomic nervous system functioning are a biological imperative for raising normative levels of being, individuals, schools, and cultural institutions must instill in their curricula both phylogenetic and experiential understanding of their neurobiology. So after a brief historical introduction to metaphysics and what is our gradual understanding of the vagus nerve function, I will move to the contemporary perspective of polyvagal theory and conclude with transdisciplinarity's intrinsic need to articulate the science, nature's way, with regard to grounding education within the whole primordial sense of transdisciplinary being. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, which is attached to the brainstem just back of your ear. And if you look in the lower left quadrant, you see the nerve, the 10th cranial nerve in relationship to the other cranial nerves, also attached to the brain stem. And here, if you follow the yellow line in these two diagrams, you can see how the vagus wanders and connects to all of our vital organs. So, in short, know thy biological self. In his prolegomena to any future metaphysics, Kant specified metaphysics are not for the use of mere learners, but of future teachers. And even teachers should not expect that they will be serviceable for the systematic exposition of a ready-made science, but for the use of the discovery of the science itself. What is the science we need to discover in ourselves? Post-Renaissance, humanity transitioned from medieval to modern world through the revival of Greek and Roman literature. Kant asked, what principle? The concept of metaphysics extracts from the cognition of experience itself. Distinguishing the science from scientific thinking, he identified centuries of tangled knowledge to be inadequate to fulfill the experience of existence that is necessary for humans to adapt somatic agency toward their psychic potential. Today, in the 21st century, overlapping values between Gnostic and empirical research has never been more clear. The earliest intuitive processing of knowledge was pre-Socratic reasoning. The philosophers who wrote about a cosmological unified natural world with alchemical processes were namely these 9 or 10 people, and some of us have our favorites within those. But the qualities of intuitive examination remain preserved. While they have remained preserved, Eastern sacred texts and traditions, self-knowledge in traditional Western culture, was largely lost to the common era. If we put Gnosticism next side by side with empirical reasoning, we see on the empirical side over 2 centuries of classifications which assimilate an objective understanding of naturally complex adaptive systems in anatomy and physiology. On the other side, on the somatic sentience side, what is projected from understanding autonomic nervous system processes is the largely inactive, latently emerging adaptive potential of our psychic organs, which we can call thought, self-awareness, intention, and attention. With experiential practice, the finer vibration rates of impartial conscience and objective reason emerge. So in my research, I found a remarkably consistent development of empirical research tracing how we came to understand the vagus function. As far back as 1504, artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci drew the reversive nerve, which was, in Galen's terms, the well-known anatomist of that time, reversive nerve meaning bidirectional. Leonardo published in his anatomical, physiological, and embryological drawings this drawing, and he wrote in his mirror handwriting, if the heart's motion comes from the reversive nerves, which have their origin in the brain, then you will clarify how the soul, animal spirits, have their origin in the left ventricle of the heart. And further, he wrote, you should attend well to these reversive nerves and to other nerves, because the motion of all the muscles arise from these nerves, with their branches diffused throughout the muscles of the body. So this is 1504. And to mention the other three major scientists who follow Da Vinci and come before Porges's work, we need to look at Darwin, Hewlings-Jackson, Paul MacLean, just briefly. So what did Darwin say about the vagus? In his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, Darwin indicated how the central nervous system and vagus evolved and adapted. He also pointed to how these systems are crucial, not only to survival, but because our social communicative functions occur largely through the facial muscles. Darwin was also the first to mention how emotional expression is reciprocally linked to physiology. That is, our expressions are not just a simple reaction to experience. By observing distinct neural pathways, he concluded that bidirectionally, the vagus exchanges information between major brain and major visceral organs, such as the heart, lungs, and abdomen. He wrote, when the heart is affected, it reacts on the brain. And the state of the brain, again, reacts through the vagus on the heart. Under any excitement, there will be much mutual action and reaction between these two most important organs of the body. Following Darwin, Hewlings-Jackson developed his theory of disillusion. And I make a small point on the left of the slide that this is perhaps the most important slide of the evening, and we'll need to discuss it further in our exchange. So attention, okay. This is somewhat of a really major discovery because Hewlings-Jackson is not well known, certainly not as well known as Darwin. But in his 1884 Croonian lectures, he states the higher nervous system, which of course means our more recently evolved neocortex, inhibits or controls the lower. And so when the higher are suddenly rendered functionless, the lower rises in activity. While Darwin's theory identified mind-body connection, Jackson illustrates its dynamic, whereby our inherited hierarchical three-brain structure is understood as disparate, unschooled, and a natural default system. And when we say natural default, we mean that our defense mechanisms are our natural default. So essentially, we are defense machines walking around when we are not able to inhibit or control the lower. You'll also notice in this diagram that there are three: social, sympathetic, and parasympathetic categories, which is different than the way biology has been taught in medical school, where the flight, fight, freeze mode is a dual system, not this three-way system. So I'll be going into that a little bit more, but let's first mention MacLean. Paul MacLean further details the phylogenetic development of three brains from reptiles, early mammals to man. In his clinical and laboratory observations, MacLean agreed with Hewlings-Jackson. The human brain is a nested hierarchy. His particular interest was observing how emotions affect the middle paleo-mammalian limbic brain, which is the red center in between the two. He wrote that the appeal for an evolutionary approach to the study of the brain is because it requires both reductionist and holistic analysis. In all animals, there are molecular commonalities with respect to genetic coding and enzymatic reactions that carry over to complex cellular assemblies. Nowhere, he says, is the uniformity of complex cellular assemblies more striking than in the cerebral evolution of vertebrates, as applies to similarities within and across classes. So now we'll move to Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which we understand at this point is a wandering nerve, that the vagus is a conduit, motor pathway that extends from the brain stem to the abdomen's digestive system. The vagus regulates our digestive, reproductive, endocrine, cardiovascular, and neurological systems via three primary circuits. The dorsal vagal, which is the lower in blue, the sympathetic nervous system, which is the middle that you see in red, and the parasympathetic vagus, which is the ventral vagal complex, which also allows the body to repair itself during sleep. The complex CVV or VVC is the third, which includes the facial expressions, the hearing, the ears, the trigeminal nerves that are in the facial muscles. Overall, Porges's model imparts a more complete understanding of how our bodies make decisions. Given natural phylogenetic stress pressures on the autonomic nervous system circuitry. As he refines Jackson and MacLean's principal findings, that humans, one, carry a more recently evolved myelated sensory apparatus, and two, the ANS functioning as a predictable hierarchical dynamic. He also brings exercises for assisting connectivity to our higher neocortical circuitry, some of which are found in sacred traditions. These are the exercises transdisciplinarity's pedagogy needs to incorporate. You might ask why. If our ability to inhibit earlier lower sub-diaphragm circuits of defense and immobilization depend on recruiting our more recently evolved neocortex, we as a species can recognize through verification what's at stake. So this goes back to Hewling Jackson's diagram that I mentioned was so important, because we know that unless the physiology learns to inhibit, we continue as defense machines. While reptilian and mammalian circuits are related to associative patterns of emotion that limits reflexive dynamic between voluntary and involuntary actions, our new third, more recently evolved neocortex is a potential reconciling force. Only with intentional effort will inner transformation of being evolve. So this is the very critical part, which is that we are human, really, in quotation marks. Our post-simian apparatus still predominates, and that we need to be taught. Now I can move to the implications if I haven't already made some of them clear. As humans discover higher levels of attention and intention for evolving somatic to psychic organs, they come directly in touch with transdisciplinary becoming processes. Because Stephen Porges's empirical understanding outdates the agonistic bidirectional fight-flight defense model, previously taught in medical schools, without ambiguity, polyvagal theory deserves considerable thought within the Transdisciplinary Congress as to its implications in relation to the challenges and advancement of humans reaching the unrealized capacity of their neocortical potential. For the vagus to function fully, it relies on vagal tone, or the tonic influence of the myelated ventral pathways of the heart to regulate the parasympathetic nervous system associated with rest, relaxation, and digestion. Porges's identification of a third circuit, the ventral vagal complex, offers a primordial understanding of the natural complexity of post-simian pre-Homo sapien striving. A signaling system for motion, emotion, and communication The parasympathetic vagus nurtures our intentional potential, cortical development. When possible to access and integrate the whole ANS range, the built-in default defense system of our older lower two-way system is held in check. The call for an integrated Gnostic and empirical approach still had its predominating foot in metaphysics when Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, William James, and Husserl theorized its eminence. I want to cite Goethe's last letter written in Weimar on his deathbed, March 17th, 1832, as evidence for the inevitable future alignment of Gnosticism with empirical research. His letter is a reply to William von Humboldt, expressing what awareness of mind he had experienced when writing part 2 of Faust. And this passage implicitly lays forth his phenomenological experience. The ancients said that the animals are taught through their organs. Let me add to this. So are humans. But they have the advantage of teaching their organs in return. Every action, and so any talent, requires some inborn faculty which acts naturally and unconsciously carries with it the necessary aptitude, and which therefore continues to act in such a way that through its law is implicit in it. Its course in the end may be aimless and purposeless. The earlier man becomes aware that there exists some craft, some art that can help him towards a controlled heightening of his natural abilities, the happier he is. Whatever he may receive from without does not harm his innate individuality. A true-to-life transdisciplinarity education would teach isomorphic qualities intrinsic to perception, pattern mapping, language, and aesthetic non-directive skills. Curricula utilizing these somatic educational tools can result in indispensable creative learning environments. For this pragmatism to make its way beyond a natural skepticism, humans and institutions must critically engage and unify what innately polarizes integration. The inherent driven conflict that naturally emerges in human neuroception dynamics is the nexus where ecological, aesthetic responses carry the specific potential to adopt all levels of transdisciplinarity's theoretical model. Polyvagal theory and autonomic nervous system regulation functions are too strongly aligned with human evolutionary development to ignore in relation to raising higher normative levels of education. A transdisciplinary education practice toward being invites individuals to research in situ illusionary brackets within the body-mind's natural environment. If principles of evolution were taught with intentional participation, the perceptual shift necessary to evolve transdisciplinary being would in time emerge. Since the parasympathetic vagus is the primary conduit for sensory neocortical adaptation processes, it becomes a core focus within transdisciplinary being curricula. To emphasize the biological dynamic that naturally regulates our autonomic nervous system in a predictable way, establishes the science, as Kant described, for all future experiential learning practices of being transdisciplinary. Today, by changing nothing but our opinions, a cultural engagement with the much sought after goals of metaphysics means adapting neural perceptions whereby the energy conserved in phenomena is expressed through the transdisciplinary instincts of science, art, and religion. A trajectory for the humanities emphasizes for cross-cultural research in human brain and autonomic nervous system dynamics has not yet been explored in other literature on transdisciplinarity. So I outline the following objectives for beginning our curricula. Co-evolutionary transdisciplinary being requires humans to evolve self-knowledge in relation to a cosmological worldview. This micro-macro worldview offers scale and context for refining ecological aesthetic perception, creating transcendental coherence where individuals recognize how their place relates to larger living systems is a gradual, natural turning point based on individual and community intentions. By refining perceptions, humans learn to parse distinctions between objective and subjective associative psychology. The vagus nerve is the biological instrument that regulates higher normative levels of perception, response, and communication in a predictable phylogenetic manner. And experiential holistic gestalt offers vagal tone, developing practices to be conducted in life itself. The transition from the predominance of our somatic survival instincts through the assisted refinement of our psychic organs, self-awareness, thought, intention, attention, evolves the higher levels of objective reason, a prerequisite when answering the question, what is a transdisciplinary being? Merci.
Jean, on ne t'entend pas. Je crois que tu as essayé de dire quelque chose.
Ah, oui, effectivement. Merci beaucoup donc à Susannah pour la qualité de son travail et de sa conférence. Et je voulais proposer donc à Peter, qui est le premier à avoir posé une question, peut-être donc de poser la question oralement directement à Susannah. Peter? Peter, vous m'entendez?
Peter, I see your question. Hi, Peter.
Il vous faudrait activer votre micro, Peter.
Bonjour toutes.
Peter asks, what do vagal nerve stimulation and autonomic nervous system biofeedback procedures teach us about the higher order? In one sense, that's a very broad question, but in our preparation for introducing
Susannah, your mic is off. Your mic is off.
Susannah, on vous entend plus?
It's been off all this time? Okay.
No, we got the beginning.
Something happened then, okay. So you understood Peter's question? Yes, you heard the question? Peter's question about vagus nerve stimulation and ANS biofeedback procedures. What did they teach us about the higher order of the vagus systems activities? Well, when we understand that there's this natural default system, unless we have this ability to pause or to have the vagal break where the lower does not become active, but we're able to inhibit our earlier brain predominating systems, what we're engaging is really listening, that we're able to hear that somewhere in us there's a signal, and our conditioning of our myelated vagus allows for this tone in our response patterns. So the most important thing is that we understand that we may be stimulated by something on the outside, but it is our response to it that matters, how we respond. I don't know, Peter, if I'm answering your question well enough. Do you?
Thank you. It is a general question, but one of the discoveries of psychology through both Pavlovian and operant conditioning was that the autonomic nervous system can learn more than we expected. So that is an external stimulus. And of course, a direct electrical stimulus would be to stimulate the vagus nerve. The question is, does that operate in the traditional notions of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system? Or does it have some potential to influence the higher, more complex polyvagal connections that you're talking about? I guess I'm just restating my question to try to make it slightly more precise, but I appreciate the answer that you gave.
Well, the first thing I think to recognize is that it's the unified system that isn't yet unified. And as vagal tone develops through our experiential practice, the reactivity becomes less predominating. And then we can begin to hear this third possibility, this third potential. And what's interesting about third force, or the force of the third, what transdisciplinarity has called the hidden third, is something that we must learn to discover for ourselves individually. And then collectively, of course, we help each other. And because these factors are not self-evident, they're not part of what we can see initially, they must be taught. Otherwise, we are left with our opinions and our predetermined attitudes that come from experiences that come from the past. Not only in our phylogenetic history, but in our experiences as children, as young adults, before we begin to start asking questions, what else, what other possibilities are there other than these dual fight-flight systems? So we're waiting to hear a signal that begins to sound louder in the body that actually is vibrational.
Ok. Et Edouard, si vous voulez poser votre question à Susannah, il vous faut activer votre micro.
Okay. Edward is asking.
Thanks, Susannah. Do you hear me?
Yes, I see your question.
I feel very comfortable and I like the aim, the trends of your presentation. I'm a practitioner who trained for 50 years people with both sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And I observed that to focus on the vagus with the parasympathetic system, you don't speak so much of the sympathetic system. When people do yoga, they do reverse movement to stimulate both. And if you are in a Japanese or Chinese monastery, the monks, they practice karate in Japan or qigong in and kung fu in Shaolin temple, and they use the access to the reptilian brain with the stimulation of the sympathetic system, and they stimulate the vague to go into deep trance or ecstasy state with meditation. And for me, it's a pendulum from a very peaceful, relaxed state to a very powerful state of capacity of fighting when necessary. It can be for sport people that have been training or whatever. So how do you balance those two branches of the neurovegetative system?
Well, I love your question. I think the moving center is all the activities that you are mentioning. You could also say movement of the vagus through the vocal cords, chanting, musical instruments, particularly ones that the breath is used, all activate the sympathetic system. Our ability to digest the impressions that come from both simultaneously is ultimately the aim. Whenever you're walking, running, moving, the sympathetic is what's being activated. There's no question there. So it's not that I meant to leave it out so much as that we're used to moving with force in the world, where our automatic systems are always at play. And therefore, this predominating force is something that needs to be brought in relationship to the sympathetic, which is always moving, always active. And the martial arts, for instance, is a discipline which is teaching you that. Any of the martial arts, for instance, that have a understanding of an aim different from your objectives of winning, for instance, the art of archery, the ability to move with conscience, with empathy, with compassion, any of those qualities, the martial arts, if I'm not wrong. I mean, I don't actually study those particular areas, but do you know those particularly, Edward? I mean, do you practice?
Okay. Susannah. Sorry. Susannah, we have one other question from Maria. Maria.
How could one exercise, train, promote intentional efforts? Does silence have a role in it? One can, yes, one can exercise, train, and promote. But are you recommending within pedagogy or schools? Is this an individual task, or is this something that's related to education as a whole, Maria? Your microphone. Your microphone, Maria. Someone needs to tell Maria her microphone is...
In any
Something happened.
Maria? Maya, could you active your microphone, please?
in any respect you would like to mention?
Okay. Well, I taught primarily in an art school, fine art school in San Francisco. And as Goethe is saying about a craft or some form of the arts, and it could be martial arts and so forth, these are disciplines where the quality of being is directly available to verify for an individual as they work. How is it going? What is the medium of my being in relationship to the media of my craft or my art? What is not taught in art schools specifically is this biological understanding, so that embodiment is not just a theory or a word that's thrown around, but that we can actually see the system for the actual biological dynamics and appreciate that this is a natural struggle, that this is something all humans have in them, and that we're meant to struggle in just this way because our evolution, our phylogenetic history is requiring this discipline. And now that we've gone through the whole empirical research, the people who were intuitively engaged in practices can now also understand the science specifically as an explanation for why chanting works to some extent to open the sympathetic qualities or the empathetic nature of our potential being. What the intuitives intuited, they didn't understand scientifically, and what the empirical measurement has brought us now has to be understood intuitively. So we're at a point where something is up to the human themselves to blend their intuitive energy with their theoretical knowledge. And this is what embodiment of the transdisciplinarity model theory manifesto will bring us. And I think the quantum field has been rattling in this direction, asking us to understand simultaneity.
Thank you, Susannah. Susannah, we have a second question from Peter.
Yes. How does polyvagal theory and practice connect to more general ideas about embodied cognition? Why is the vagus nerve given priority over neurosomatic connections, including sympathetic? I may have touched on some of Peter's question already in my earlier responses. The vagus is, if you can think of it as this central conduit. It is like what a main artery or pipe would be in an electrical system. There really is something like a split second before this system will default in view of the Hewlings-Jackson model. So it's this conditioning of the vagus that is so critical to allow us to move beyond, to trans, to receive a new impression, a fresh impression, rather than one that's coming from our formatory habits.
Très bien, merci. Peter, vous êtes content de la... Vous êtes satisfait de la réponse?
Well, polyvagal theory is not without its controversies. And the idea that it focuses on just one nerve, however big and how important, makes me wonder about the bigger picture of embodied cognition in general. I think it's very, very clear that we are not disembodied brains in vats of nutrient solutions. We are creatures that only think in an embodied form. So clearly the vagus nerve is part of that, but there's a larger part to embodiment that I just wondered what Susan's reflections were, and whether the theory focuses just too much on one particular part of that anatomy. Thank
well,
you.
Peter, I noticed that Mark Turner will be speaking in your part of the program at the World Congress. And I would be very interested to know what Mark has to say about the vagus, if he's aware of this work. We are involved in a detoxifying process when we're talking about introducing vagal brake, because the vagus is attached to all the vital organs and it's a bi-directional system. I don't think that there can really be any argument that in the process of our learning to vibrate at a finer rate, to hear these signals, that we are in a process of detoxifying our more aggressive, our more reactionary, our heavier metals, the things that are in our system that are going through a process of, I keep using the words detoxify, but they're being excreted, literally. And so it's not a metaphor, and it's a dynamic that has a relationship to how we feel our feelings, how we think our thoughts, and that we need to feel our thoughts and think our feelings and move more in a category. I don't know, Jack, can I invite you, Jack Kane, to maybe bring something here about your work or your impressions of the importance of this listening capacity, and maybe what you understand about tomatis, since the French are with us tonight.
Well, well, Susannah, I'm not sure I can add anything so useful. But the concept of listening to another part of ourselves is something that is a big part of the work I do with clients. Because there are parts of ourselves that really can rise above the systems you're talking about and have a different point of view. So from that point of view, and I was touched by Maria, who raised the idea of what's the role of silence. And Peter also would probably recognize that there is a very important role. So by entering into a state of silence, you have more possibility of connecting to something that is above this reactive human animal structure that we're living inside. And it will allow us to perhaps, hopefully, engage in an education that would be somehow a real education instead of, as you say, just mechanical and associative.
Right. So I would say when we speak of the force of transdisciplinarity's model, the implicit force comes to these other dimensions, which are very different from our current mode of learning by rote education. And many of these models for martial arts and disciplines are on the fringes, on the outside of the university system. So they're there, they exist. And most of my own research when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, doing my doctorate, for instance, came from outside the university. The dual system of our defense models for arguing or defending our dissertations is still in this dualistic model. And until we have safe environments for learning that allow us to process these deeper listening qualities, even our environments for learning at the university and lower school levels needs to be revised. One of the questions that we might ask, given the pandemic and other forms of barbarism that we're beginning to see emerge, is whether or not we need to say that this is needed, as much as most people are beginning to awaken to these realities as they're taking place. And our hope is that, you know, after the pandemic, we don't forget them, and that we're prepared with this information to recognize that the transdisciplinarity theoretical model has a real place, but only if it's going to begin to move towards these experiential environmental conditions that really assist our learning.
Okay, Susannah, we have one other question from M.W. and after one other from Edward Stack.
Yes, nature as discourse, which is the title of my talk, lets us observe its force all the time. We are part of that. And while we observe nature, some of us recognize what a tree is doing. We breathe out and it receives what it needs for its food, and it gives us our food. So there's a reciprocal relationship there. The problem is that we don't seem to recognize our place. We don't seem to recognize that we are part of the same system, and that it's not outside ourselves, but inside ourselves. So we can learn from looking out in nature. Our fault is that we're not looking in either simultaneously or when we move away from objects back to ourselves.
Ok. Est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre a une question?
Learning to master the activity of both parasympathetic and sympathetic branches can start with kids at kindergarten to help them concentrate, handle their feelings, explore challenges. Absolutely. The earlier, the better. This is one of these things like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? At the university level, if we're able to provide the curricula for educators to learn, then of course they would bring this information to the kindergarten level. What do parents need to know? What do mothers need to know? Where we're learning, unfortunately, is trauma, from people who are victims at a very critical level. And this is the mainstay of Stephen Porges's work, because it was clinicians, it was people in emergency and trauma rooms that first appreciated the polyvagal theory, because it went beyond medicating. It helped them develop therapies and support systems for helping and assisting those in critical need. And I asked some very similar question, Edward, to Stephen when I first met him. I have done several interviews with him. And the issue is at this point that we know leadership is causing the trauma. Our president has created an entirely new population on the border of Mexico, for instance. And we have to understand that our legal and political system is one of the dualities of our history, black and white, right, wrong, Republican, Democrat, red, blue, whichever, you know, these divisions are. So the third has never been rattling so much, but the economics override our moral charter. And we know too much now about the science to let this continue. I mean, it's a good question to almost ask, at what point is it a legal infringement to our human rights not to teach this biological functioning as part of our birthright? The NIH receives all of our tax dollars to do this research, and then it goes to pharmaceutical companies. This is a very long-standing, egregious act of medicine and economics. And if it doesn't change in the school system so that more people understand the benefits of this difficult past that we're in, we will continue to learn the hard way, which is that our species is at stake. So it's very complex. Humans are complex, but more have to feel and hear through this work. And silence will be coming. I think not many people feel this silence through a question, which I had when I was a child. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? There are a lot of arrows now pointing in this direction. And we ourselves in the transdisciplinarity community need to look at the moral charter. We need to speak to UNESCO about how to find these principles within a global action. And when we work globally, how does that help the local situations? So there's, you know, a lot of back and forth through scale, particularly with the environmental issues. So I see lots more questions coming here. Let's see. Christian, what do you think about the possibility that we may be participants in a continuous evolutionary process in a gigantic athnor, in a process similar to those narrated in medieval alchemical literature with carefully constructed and controlled environmental conditions, so that we do develop ever more sophisticated vibrational perception organs? Well, I think personally that we are participants, whether we know it or not. We are either food for the moon, or we are vessels in an evolutionary move towards becoming containers for spirit. That's the broadest scale at our death. And how we live our lives. We are either part of a devolving octave, or we are part of an evolving octave. Nature doesn't require us to be one or the other. It just is. So Stephen said at one time to me, which face do you wish to turn towards?
Okay.
Okay. Well, Gurdjieff, of course, is in Domingo's comment. I could say quite a lot about that. I don't know. But I found a direct correlation of which I feel he knew. He was alive at the time of Hewlings Jackson. He could have heard those lectures. He certainly knew of Darwin and evolution. And his whole philosophy coming from the various schools in Asia that he traveled to on his journeys. East has met West, as he predicted it would one day, and that there would be no question about esoteric ideas at this point in time. So thank you, Domingo. I would be very pleased to talk with you more about that. Margarita is asking a very specific question in regards to fascia, which is in the muscles, and the vagus. I am not a practitioner of body work, but I know that fascia builds up and adds to the restriction that we feel in our muscles. And so as far back as Leonardo, in what I quoted from his journal, there's a direct relationship because the vagus stimulates all the muscles through the nervous system, and sensation, coming to sensation in the body, a feeling for oneself, which in the best of circumstances introduces heat, sensation of expansion, opening. If I think body work is done, there is then a relationship that supports through breathing, primarily breathing, this letting go of tension in the body.
Thank you, Susan. May I? I'm a practitioner of fascia therapy. That's
Wonderful.
why I am very interested with this question. And fascia is not only the muscles, it's everything is protected by the fascia. But anyway, the answer you gave me is quite in relationship with my experience. I mean, that's through the fascia, you have this possibility of being related to the sensation. And not only sensation, I mean, it's not only the body's sensation, but it's also the conscience of all the systems. It's the possibility of developing this perception.
Absolutely, there's no question. I should just mention that for the World Congress, C-Trans has given me one of their weeks to become the moderator for the 2 days, and Stephen Porges will be the keynote speaker on February 3rd. And I invite you to participate, and anyone who would like to ask direct questions to Stephen. And he will also be participating in a conversation on Friday, February 5th, with Harold Terry Lindahl, who I have worked with now for almost 30 years in the Gurdjieff work. And this will be about the science of being. And we will certainly have time for questions and be touching on some of these major points. I was hoping very much that by acknowledging the transdisciplinarity community today here, CIRET in Paris, that I would be helping to bring this model, this short history of how we've come to understand the vagus through centuries, and that from this discussion, it would lead to others. And what's important really about Paris in all of this is very significant, because there is a very long history before the cybernetic field, which came to Paris, that I feel that I'm very honored to offer this new set of principles and parameters for thinking, because Henri Labourite is a Parisian hero for you to look at biology and structure, his F.A. And all of the continental philosophers that I have enjoyed so much over the years, from Bachelard to Baudrillard to Benjamin to all the ones that begin with B for some reason. The feeling of poets and writers, our intuitive wisdom that has come and been acknowledged around May 68 at the Sorbonne, and things that developed that came through Paris as transdisciplinarity's word was coined. This is the first chapter of my doctorate, where I try to relate that history, but essentially the philosophers of France are particularly important to us when we begin to look at curriculum, and there should be a revival, of reading the French, of which, of course, Monsieur Gurdjieff joined. and lived in Paris until the end of his life. So we have a tradition to honor here, of which this biology is part of Labourite's work. Florent, are you familiar with Labourite, or is Jean there, or Marc Dubono? I see an MW. Is that you, Marc?
Familiar with who, sorry?
Labourite, biology et structure.
Maybe not so much for me, not yet.
Yeah, maybe Marc, maybe PLASTIR.
Henri Laborie was a member of the group of 10 who introduced the complex thinking in France. So it was very important for transdisciplinarity.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I did not understand Henri Laborie. Yes, of course, Henri Laborie, of course. The three main reactions behind when you have an aggression, etc. Yes, thank you, Basarab, for your precision.
Basarab, if I'm not mistaken, he was an anesthetologist. You see, these studies of the vagus come from understanding things like epilepsy and watching how the body reacts before being put to sleep for surgery. And it was outside the traditions of medicine to look organically. And this is the saddest thing, is that we don't appreciate nature, the natural organism, from the point of view of observation and response patterns. And so these people like Labourite, they wrote, and now I would say Porges' work verifies all of this in the way that their observations should be reviewed again, so that young people today know more about who these people were. Someone is saying Edward met Labourite in 75. Very good. Wonderful. So we may be coming up against time at this point, Florent. I don't know if people would like.
I let Jean to decide if we still have, we are quite close from the end of this wonderful meeting, but maybe we have a little time to take one comment or another question, depends on the audience. I'm looking on the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Many people are thanking now for the time we spent together, enjoying your very nice speech. So if we still not have any more comment or question, many people is thanking you. Maybe it's time to come close to the conclusion of this mensual meeting. I'm very happy that a lot of people say yes to join this meeting with you. You prepared very well your intervention by sending many materials in different languages. And also your presentation in French was an help for this moment we spent together. So if no one have something to add, maybe we can already highlight the pleasure to join, to Jean, to talk to us about the next meeting in December. Jean, je te donne la parole si tu veux nous présenter la surprise de Noël, la prochaine conférence.
Allez,
à toi l'honneur.
Tout à fait. Donc, merci beaucoup, donc, Susannah, pour la qualité donc, de cette conférence et pour le thème qui a été abordé, qui était extrêmement intéressant. Alors, la prochaine conférence aura lieu le 29 décembre. Elle sera présentée en portugais par Abreu Pax. Et je vous ai mis donc le titre en portugais, Migração fractal de provérbio práticas sujeitos e narrativas entrelaçadas. Voilà, donc désolé pour ma prononciation. Voilà.
Est-ce que tu peux nous en faire une traduction en français ou en anglais?
Écoute, là je n'ai que le titre en portugais, donc je vous l'enverrai ultérieurement. Voilà, je vous l'enverrai ultérieurement. Donc, merci à toutes et à tous pour votre participation. Au maximum, nous avons été 24 participants, donc c'est un score qui est très, très honorable. Nous avions une quarantaine de personnes qui s'étaient inscrites, mais donc je suppose qu'elles n'ont pas pu venir, elles n'ont pas pu donc se connecter. Mais voilà, on se rend compte quand même que tous les mois, eh bien, nous avons environ toujours à peu près une vingtaine de participants. Hein, donc je crois que c'est quand même c'est intéressant. Ça montre quand même donc une certaine vivacité de la part des membres du CIRET. Voilà.
Parfait, merci beaucoup Jean. Et puis pas seulement des membres de CIRET, parce que grâce à toi,
il y avait
cette
aussi
réunion mensuelle
des futurs membres,
devient un peu une vitrine qui montre la vivacité de notre association et surtout du travail de ses membres, tous engagés là où ils sont, qu'ils soient scientifiques, qu'ils soient enseignants, qu'ils soient artistes. Nous en avions plusieurs parmi nous ce soir, qu'ils soient chercheurs, qu'ils écrivent, etc. Donc, c'est vraiment très précieux, ce moment d'échange que tu nous offres et nous te remercions à chaque fois pour cela. Donc, eh bien, si plus personne ne souhaite ajouter, du coup, je me suis mis à parler en français. Mais j'espère que tout le monde me comprend. I hope everyone is understand me. I finish in English in honor of Susannah for a very nice speech. You're a very soon member, a very recent member in our association, Susannah, and we really appreciate the presentation you did offer to us. And it's a kind of encouragement for each of us to pursue this nice network we are creating all together. We are very fun to attend the next presentation of December, and I encourage all the members who have registered to the third World Congress of online. It's difficult. I'm sorry. The third World Congress of Transdisciplinary online, which offers video conferences every Wednesday and every Friday, 10 a.m. Mexico time and 6 p.m. Europe time. I let each of you make the calculation for your own geographical country. So I encourage each of the participants and CIRET member, because the participation to the World Congress is included in the fees of your participation, annual participation. So I encourage each of us to continue to benefit to the video conference of the World Congress. And if you can't be present in real time, every video conference is then provided online on YouTube channel of the Congress. So you might participate in real time or in a second time. Thank you very much, all the audience. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Susannah, Bassarab. We were very pleased that you've been able to be with us tonight. It's always a great pleasure to appreciate your beautiful and smiling face with us. And see you at least next month.
Yes, okay, very good.
Thank you very much
for my day, and you have your wine and I have my coffee. So, I hope to see you all in Paris very soon.
Let's say that. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Susannah. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.